The following presentation was given to the GWAC Architecture Council in January of 2024 by Danielle Sass Byrnett from NARUC, entitled NARUC Grid Data Sharing. Welcome, Danielle.
Happy to be here with you all today. I'm Danielle Sass Byrnett. I am the Senior Director for the National Association of Regulatory Utility Commissioners, NARUC's Center for Partnerships and Innovation. So we are the technical assistance team for commissioners and commission staff across the country, supporting their complex decision making, which you all are familiar with from your vantage points as well. Their complexities are not strictly engineering, as you know, but also financial, economic development, workforce, and others, all of the various barriers that are faced in getting to a distributed modern grid. I am going to take the screen. Great, thank you. So I have prepared some slides today that we are going to share to talk about an initiative NARUC undertook about a year and change ago. Can somebody please tell me if you are seeing the screen share?
We are.
Outstanding, thank you. Okay, so the resources I'm going to be discussing today are under the NARUC Grid Data Sharing Collaborative, and it's specifically a framework and a suite of resources that we developed collaboratively with others. I just put in the chat a link to the active NARUC website that will show you everything I'm going to be discussing. Of course, I didn't do this, sorry. We released these resources in November of 2023, so just a couple of months ago. And I'm going to be providing an overview of the framework that was mentioned on the cover slide, a document called a Summary of Current Practices, and a grid data sharing playbook, which describes how our members and stakeholders can use the framework. And there's also a QR code if you prefer, in addition to the URL that I put into the chat. Of course, I didn't do this alone. I was very grateful to partner with NARUC CPI's Deputy Director, Lynn Costantini, who is a cybersecurity subject matter expert and Deputy Director, and a couple of great folks, Benjamin Stafford at ICF and Chris Villarreal, who I believe has been part of GWAC over many years, from Plugged In Strategies. And it was with support from Department of Energy's Office of Electricity and CSER office. So we were including both cybersecurity and grid modernization concepts. And we were grateful to work with a wide range of stakeholders, NARUC members, utility experts, DER advocates and experts, cyber experts, and various advocates, including, I heard some familiar voices here on the call already. So what we were aiming to do, and is now in use, is to support the utility commissions in their role as state decision makers, as they, in particular, adjudicate interests among utilities and stakeholders around grid data sharing, to come up with a framework that each state and set of stakeholders could really tailor to their own goals and their own priorities. So throughout a series of 4 workshops over the last couple of years, we established a facilitated method of working through what we called use cases. They're slightly different from engineering use cases, data sharing options that could meet various needs. And we also explored particular risks and trade-offs associated with the different options to come up with the framework and materials I'm going to share. Quick note on scope and then process, and then we'll jump into it. On scope, this is really about distribution system data, part of why I'm talking to you all. Distribution level grid data, information about grid assets, system conditions, system constraints, posting capacity style information about DERs, etc. We also talked about data portals and data sharing, of course, but didn't go into a tremendous amount of detail on that. You'll see a little bit more later. And certainly we were concerned with things like locational and temporal information. We were not talking about customer consumption, customer energy consumption, any privacy or personally identifiable information. We were not debating who owns data. That is going to be a state-specific question in most cases when we're talking about the distribution grid. And we were focused much more on what data a utility might make available to others rather than what data a DER might make available to the utility. And you'll see that reflected in the use cases. Really briefly, as I mentioned, this was a 2-year project. We went through a stepwise approach. There were about 24 folks that we invited, experts from across the country, from the 4 key stakeholder groups I mentioned: utilities, commissions, DER, developers and advocates, and cyber experts. So they are represented with the individual person standing there at workshops. And then we had a couple of broader invite workshops where we got feedback from a broader set of stakeholders on the draft framework, incorporated updates, and then we did a simulation and dissemination workshop in November as part of our rollout. So let's get into the materials. I'm going to start with the summary of state practices. This is an attempt to gather information about utilities who have made various distribution grid related data available, either fully publicly or with some kind of password sign-on process, some kind of a screening process. Most of it's public. In some cases, the data is available because of a commission order. In other cases, the utility has released the data without being directed to by a commission. And you'll find information in here in a table format that talks about which state, of course, which utilities, what proceedings, and includes a description and links to where you can find the data portals. We cover about 40 utilities in 20 states in the summary that we've pulled together so far, and I absolutely welcome being alerted to additional places where these data can be found, and would invite, as it says in the document, which you can find from the website, would invite submissions of that nature to me, and we will get it updated. The second critical piece, and really the centerpiece of all of this, is the framework that was ultimately developed. The framework is this puzzle piece diagram of 7 categories. It identifies considerations and key questions that a set of decision makers and stakeholders might want to ask or have information to answer for themselves before making a decision, or to help inform a decision about which grid data should be shared and with whom and under what circumstances, etc. A quick note on the diagram: the matching colors do identify categories that are closely related. Our intent was that this is a framework. It is not a process. A state will come up with its own process to work through and figure out what information it needs. And I'll say more about that in a moment. But as we worked through and developed this framework with our stakeholder group and our collaborative, we were often getting to the point where use case and state priorities were very closely related, and folks might want to do them in one order or another. And the current situation and the desired outcomes were very closely related. And understanding what data details need to be shared and what the impacts of those data details would be and what the tactics related to those risks and data details, they all kind of go together in groups. So we've shown that through the color coding. How it actually gets used will be up to whomever's using it, of course. As I mentioned, it is our intention that this is a framework and not a process. Information might not be needed in every single category before a commission makes a decision. It is not focused on how to implement the sharing, but how to make a decision about what should be shared. And of course, the results are going to vary by state. Each state has its own policy priorities, its own executive orders, its own legislation, its own jurisdiction for the commission. And so that kind of context, which is critically important, will have a huge impact on what a decision ends up looking like coming out of a decision-making process around grid data sharing. So that's all in our minds and should be in anyone else's as they use the framework. The final document, I'm just doing the high level and then we'll go into the framework categories, but the document is the grid data sharing playbook. And this explains the framework in more detail, and I'll be providing some screenshots. It also has a short section on how to use the framework, ideas for decision making. There are lots of options, and we got information and insights from the collaborative members about different approaches that could be used by a commission. Of course, there are going to be some process challenges, and we articulate what some of those are and how some of them could be overcome. And then of particular importance, I think, to your group is the sample use cases. So the use cases were developed iteratively as we were developing the framework, both to make sure that we weren't creating something in the abstract that wouldn't work, and to be able to give folks, whether it's our members or others who are going to use this framework, a starting point that was reasonable and would allow them to start past a blank piece of paper. So we explored and articulated three different use cases. One was how grid data sharing could improve DER interconnection. Another was how it could enable fleet vehicle electrification. And then the third was the potential for grid data sharing to enable distribution on wires solutions. And for each of those use cases, there are multiple pages in the appendix of the grid data sharing playbook that show the different questions one would ask as part of the framework and what some sample answers might be. Those are not right answers, but they are reasonable starting points, and they are intended to reflect what an imaginary state might see in a decision-making process. They, again, are not the right answers. So I know the intent was for me to keep going and save questions for the end, but feel free to throw questions in the chat as I go. I can look at them while I'm talking. At this point, I was going to go into the framework and talk about the 7 categories, what kind of questions are in there, and what kind of information we've provided in the playbook to support the use of this framework. And then we'll go from there. So there's not a first, but in the playbook, we had to put things in some order, of course. So the first triangle in the framework in the playbook is around use case. As I mentioned, this is not a engineering use case. This is the what and the why of the scenario that's being envisioned. In what context are we thinking about grid data? Why would it be important? What might be relevant? Who thinks that they would want access to additional electric utility data in this scenario? So that one's pretty quick and easy, and you can find, as I said, more detailed descriptions in the playbook. The other orange triangle is around state priorities, and I think I've probably made the case for this already. It's really important to understand what a state's goals and policies and authorities are that will be relevant to the use case and relevant to grid data sharing. And so we provide a series of prompt questions here to help a set of stakeholders or commission get at the heart of what might be most relevant. In particular, in some states, there's the possibility that the commission presumes data openness. And so the utility would need to explain the risks of sharing data. In other states, the presumption is that data utility holds is not publicly available. And so a DER developer or a requester would need to demonstrate their need for the data. So that's an important point to start with and ensure everybody has the same understanding of what's the premise going in around burden of proof or data privacy or data openness, in addition to things like state policies and authorities. I'll spend a little bit longer on this triangle. This is one of the turquoise ones around the the status quo, current situation. What data are already available? What additional data are being requested? And what are the options for enabling the use case? So here we're focused on, can someone already access the data that are being requested? Could it be easily assembled from resources or paid vendors, even if a subset of stakeholders doesn't know where that is right now? But if we can get that all out on the table, maybe that resolves some of the concerns that different parties might have. Articulating how the requested information would actually support desired outcomes and state priorities. And so I'll get to the outcomes in just a minute. As you can see, these different questions all relate to each other. Could the goal for the outcomes for the use case be achieved through some other means beyond sharing particular data? And what would be the impact of not sharing the data? This was a point that came up multiple times in the collaborative and we thought was really important to emphasize. But if data are not shared, what is the counterfactual? What do we not get? What would happen if the data are not shared soon? Are we missing windows of opportunity if grid data are not available sooner than later? And you can see in the playbook that we talk in the context of current practices about data availability, about data quality, about accuracy, about data location and accessibility. So there's some guidance in the playbook about how to think about some of these fundamental status quo data sharing questions. And I've included a snapshot from one of the use cases about how some of these questions might be answered. There is a note in the chat about having something that captures state data sharing requirements and guidance. We have some of that in the summary of state practices, and we have talked about a potential next step support being a more comprehensive review of what are the different requirements from maybe a cybersecurity or a security standpoint, but not necessarily on data sharing beyond the summary of state practices, because that really does, I think, get at the requirements as a baseline. And then the second turquoise triangle is about desired outcomes. So this is really intended to anchor the framework in what is the public interest motivation for moving forward in a grid data sharing decision process. What would the use case scenario look like if a successful approach were in place? What's the value of enabling the use case to the stakeholders, the commission, the state from a policy perspective and societal goals perspective? There's also a question about interoperability, format, structure, and consistency. I'll get to that a little bit, but there is not a detailed discussion about that in the framework or the playbook. So the final set of triangles, puzzle pieces for the framework is around the data details, the risks, and the trade-offs. So we will talk about this a little bit here. On data details, this is now getting much more specific. And so in status quo, we could envision that someone's saying they want interconnection data and they need to know what the queue looks like. Then when you get to data details, you need to get really specific on what kind of temporal basis, what kind of granularity from a location perspective, how frequently is it going to be updated, all of those kind of information. So what is the level of data quality and granularity that is necessary to enable the use case? Are some data need to have versus nice to have? Who has the data really, not just the utility, but where in the utility, what system does the utility use for collecting the data? How would they make it available? What's the relative sensitivity of specific data details? And you can see in the playbook that we have some examples as part of our use case exploration. So one of them is here around interconnection. This is a set of potential data details that a set of stakeholders might ask for related to interconnection, to speed DER interconnection processes around different feeder level data, queue data, data about what might be happening on the system is already planned, etc. The last two triangles around potential impacts, and this is really the risks and consequences, or potential risks of consequences of sharing additional data details beyond current practice. So all the words there are important and were chosen carefully. The intent with this framework is not necessarily to reopen past decisions, but to look at requests for additional grid data sharing in the context of, are there incremental risks? Would there be additional concerns with sharing additional data? To whom do those risks accrue? Which data elements are associated with the risks? And there was a lot of discussion among the collaborative members about what kind of risks really are brought on by sharing which kind of data. And there's not a universal answer for that, of course, but it was a really important discussion within the context of the collaborative. And so you will find in the playbook a lot of exploration of this line of questioning. So, what would be the consequences of additional risk? Who would be harmed? Do particular data elements associate with particular risks? And we provided a framework for categorizing potential risks associated with grid data sharing in the playbook. This was borrowed from a UK effort, their strategy for a modern digitalized energy system, and then vetted and tested within the NARUC Grid Data Sharing Collaborative to see if the categories of risk that are presented here around consumer privacy, consumer impact, security, and commercial risks held up against the various risks and concerns that stakeholders are hearing in these kinds of discussions. And they did. The categorization worked very well for helping to understand and consider different types of risks differently, because going from risk, one wants to figure out how to mitigate those. And so that gets us to what for today's purposes is the final triangle around data sharing tactics. What approaches could be implemented to minimize the potential negative impacts of grid data sharing? This line of questioning is really around exploring what the options are. Are there industry standards? Are there standards of practice that can mitigate risk? Certainly some of the industry standards that you all work on and support are in those categories for sure. And those are referenced in the playbook. Also discussions about the relative costs and levels of effort to implement different risk mitigation options. So there was a lot of discussion in the collaborative about the idea of putting things, password protected, asking holders of data from the utility to hold certain certifications or attest or certify that they have cyber insurance or any number of other approaches. And we're providing a set of questions that can help to tease out what would be the potential costs and benefits of some of these different mitigation options and who would bear the costs of those approaches, and would the mitigation approaches ultimately eliminate the desired outcomes. So if you put up too high a wall, are you no longer actually enabling data sharing? All questions to be considered in the context of some kind of a process in a state for making a decision. We do talk in the playbook about some existing potential data sharing tactics and around existing laws on sensitive information or critical electric industry infrastructure, or cybersecurity requirements and other approaches that exist right now and can be leveraged and considered in the context of grid data sharing decisions. So those are the 7 boxes of the framework pretty quickly. There's a lot more information in the playbook. And the last piece I will highlight is just in the playbook, the section around using the framework. There are, as I mentioned, a few different thoughts about how decision-making could happen. None of these are perfect. There would be benefits and challenges to each, but we did want to reflect the collaborative members' discussions about how decision-making could happen, and also the reality that implementing some of this is going to be very challenging. But there are potential solutions, and there are, yes, somebody asked, 20 states that have at least some utility who is sharing grid data in a public way, whether it's by commission order or not, and at least 40 utilities who are in fact making some grid data available publicly.
Thanks, Danielle, for the great presentation. For more information about the Gridwise Architecture Council, please visit our website at gridwiseac.org, and you may also want to subscribe to our YouTube channel at the link provided. Thank you.